All right, here we go again. We're on Atonement, Lesson 1, and we'll just revise a bit what we've done. We're asking ourselves, what is atonement? What's this word actually mean? And we said it simply means at one-ment. We saw that it's a very comprehensive word and includes a lot of other things, and we included in this word 4 words: atonement, reconciliation, expiation and propitiation. Now, we saw that each one of these words actually carries within it part of the meaning of each of the other of these 4 words and more. Atonement is a comprehensive word. And so we looked at atonement and we saw that it was satisfaction or expiation given for wrong, the reconciliation of man with God through the sacrificial death of Christ. That means at one-ment, to be at one with God again. Then we looked at reconciliation and we saw that it's restoration to the divine favour, to make no longer opposed, to cause to accept something unpleasant, to settle a quarrel, or to make two apparently conflicting things compatible or able to agree together or consistent with each other. Then we looked at expiation and we saw it means to blot out, to make amends for, to atone for sin or wrongdoing. See, each of these words contains part of the meaning of the other words within this group. And then propitiation, it means to appease a god or a person, to make well disposed, to provide satisfaction of the righteous demands of a holy God. And then mercy seat, the word means mercy seat, but we'll see later on what that's about. So we see that atonement is first of all to cover, and we saw that's the literal meaning, specifically with bitumen, tar, you remember that? Now keep that in the back of your mind because that's important, right? It means to blot out, and so it's to cover, to blot out, to reconcile, to satisfy the righteous demands of a holy God. So atonement covers all of those things. Now we could look at each one of them separately and build an entire doctrine out of each one of them, but we won't. We'll take them all through together because they're all coming under the heading of atonement, and we'll see how this doctrine teaches us the truths about each of these things, about our sin being covered, our sin being blotted out, about us being reconciled with God, about God's righteous demands, a holy God's righteous demands being satisfied. So what's required for atonement to take place? Well, we can work this out. Obviously, sin must be covered, otherwise it wouldn't be atonement. And atonement is the doctrine of how sin is to be dealt with for there to be reconciliation between God and mankind. So sin must be covered. For a doctrine of atonement to be needed, mankind must need for his sin to be covered, and he does. But sin not only must be just covered over, it must be blotted out, or atonement hasn't happened. Sin must not only be covered over and blotted out, it must actually be removed, taken right away. And then the price for sin must be paid. Now, how do we know that there's a price for sin? Well, Genesis 3:3 says to us, Adam and Eve were in the Garden of Eden, right? And they were there happily in the Garden of Eden. And it says in verse 1, "Now the serpent was more subtle than any beast of the field which the Lord God had made. And he said to the woman," this is the serpent, said, Yea, hath God said, Ye shall not eat of every tree of the garden? And the woman said unto the serpent, We may eat of the fruit of the trees of the garden, but of the fruit of the tree which is in the midst of the garden, God hath said, Ye shall not eat it, neither shall ye touch it, lest ye die. Right. Now, there was a price to be paid for sin. If they touched the fruit of the tree, then the price was what? It was death. They were going to die. And so, what's required for atonement to take place? Well, the price for sin has to be paid. So, whoever sins has to die. And then, the paying of this price must give satisfaction for sin. So the paying of this price must provide propitiation. Right. And having paid the price, God's anger must be appeased. There must be reconciliation. God must be able to be turned from being wanting to judge us for our sin to being able to accept us again. So conditions must be changed so that God can extend His mercy, and the changing of these conditions must allow God's grace to intervene, for things to be changed so we can be reconciled to God. Right? So now we've established what atonement is. And you say, well, we've established that it's a very complicated sort of a thing. But it'll get simpler from here on, because now we're going to establish why we need atonement. And once we understand why we need atonement, it'll make sense to us what atonement actually is. Right, Genesis 1:1 tells us what? In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth, right? God put His creation in place. Verse 4 says, verse 3, and God said, Let there be light, and there was light, and God saw the light, and it was good. And God divided the light from the darkness, right? Verse 4 tells us that the light was good. Now, when God created light, that was the basis of all life upon earth. Without light, there can be no life. Now, what is light? Well, light is a form of kinetic energy. It's moving energy. And it's the energy from which all the energy that is a part of us being alive comes from the light. The plants make chlorophyll, the cycle of it all. And so light is the basic thing, and of course God created that first, because the Bible is perfectly scientifically correct, and we can count on the fact that the Bible hasn't got scientific mistakes in it, the same as it hasn't got historical mistakes in it. And when God made the light, God said it was good. How good does that make it? Well, if it's good in God's eyes, it's certainly as good as it can be. And then in verse 10, God called the dry land earth, and the gathering together of the waters called He seas, and God saw that it was good. And in verse 12, and the earth brought forth grass and herb yielding seed after his kind, and tree yielding fruit whose seed was in itself after his kind, and God saw that it was good. And verse 18, and to rule, and verse 17, and God set them, verse 16, and God made two great lights, the greater light to rule the day, and the lesser light to rule the night. He made the stars also, and God set them in the firmament of the heaven, to give light upon the earth, and to rule over the day and over the night, and to divide the light from the darkness, and God saw that it was good. Verse 21, and God created great whales, and every living creature that moveth, which the waters brought forth abundantly after their kind, and every winged fowl after his kind, and God saw that it was good. And verse 25, And God made the beasts of the earth after his kind, and the cattle after their kind, and everything that creepeth upon the earth after his kind, and God saw that it was good. Right. And so we see in verse 31, and God saw everything that he had made, including mankind. Right. We'll just go back and read here. Verse 26, and God said, let us make man in our image after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God created he him, male and female created he them. And in verse 31, 31, it says, and God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good. And the evening and the morning were the sixth day. And so we have the creation. God made everything, and God pronounced everything that he made good. And when he looked at everything that he'd made, when it was finished, he pronounced it very good. And so at creation, everything was perfect. Everything in complete harmony and communion with God. God's presence with his creation was a normal part of life. Now, how do we know that? Because it said, and they heard the voice of the Lord God walking in the garden in the cool of the day. Now, obviously, they were used to God having his presence with them in the Garden of Eden, and they were perfectly happy with that. Right? Now, when God made everything, he made it for a specific reason. He made it there in such a way that mankind could live in a perfect environment. And we go back to Genesis 1, 26 to 28. It said, and God said, let us make man in our image. Right? God created man. And let us make man in our image after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God created he him, male and female created he them. And God blessed them, and God said unto them, be fruitful and multiply, and replenish the earth, and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over every living thing that moveth upon the earth. So let's know how mankind fitted into this picture. Man was made in God's image, right? God said, let us make man in our image. And so, having made man in his image, there's certain things we can know were true of the creation when God had finished it. Man was made in God's image, so man was in perfect communion with God, right? There was no barrier between man and God. They were in perfect communion. Man was able to abide in God's presence in perfect confidence. And in fact, he had no concept of what fear was. To be in God's presence for him was a normal thing. There was no fear in it. There was no fear of judgment or fear that he would be punished or fear of it in any way whatsoever. He was able to abide in God's presence in perfect confidence. And mankind was in perfect harmony with God. All right? And not only that, he was in perfect harmony with the creation. God said, behold, I have given you every herb bearing seed which is upon the face of all the earth, and every tree in which is the fruit of a tree yielding seed, it shall be to you for meat. Now, meat there means food, right? He was in perfect harmony with the creation. Nothing was to be killed to be eaten. All the animals were vegetarian, and creation was in perfect harmony with itself, and mankind was in perfect harmony with creation. And mankind was different to the animals in this way. He was able to choose to obey or disobey God. Man was made with a free will. Now, we need to get a very clear understanding of this. How do we know that mankind was made with a free will? Well, we read Genesis 3:1-6. And now the serpent was more subtle than any beast of the field which the Lord God had made. And he said unto the woman, Yea, hath God said, Ye shall not eat of every tree of the garden? And the woman said unto the serpent, We may eat of the fruit of the trees of the garden, but the fruit of the tree which is in the midst of the garden, God hath said, Ye shall not eat it, neither shall ye touch it, lest ye die. And the serpent said unto the woman, Ye shall not surely die. For God doth know that in the day ye eat thereof, then your eyes shall be opened, and ye shall be as gods, knowing good and evil. And when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was pleasant to the eyes, and a tree to be desired to make one wise, she took of the fruit thereof and did eat, and gave also unto her husband with her, and he did eat. And the eyes of them both were opened, and they knew that they were naked, and they sewed fig leaves together and made themselves aprons. Now, did they have a free will or not? God said to them, You won't eat of the fruit of the tree of the garden, right? But of the fruit of the tree which is in the midst of the garden, God said, Ye shall not eat of it, neither shall ye touch it, lest ye die. And then God having said to them, You won't do that, they went and did it. Now, did they have a free will? Obviously, they had a free will, and they chose to disobey God. First of all, Eve, and then she gave it to her husband, and he chose to disobey God too. Now, if we say mankind didn't have a free will, and God made him do it, then what we're saying is that God is punishing him for something that he couldn't help. Now, God wouldn't do that because God is perfectly just. We go back to the attributes of God, and the attributes of God tell us that God cannot be unjust. So God gave them a choice. He said, Don't do it, and if you do it, then you'll die. And mankind chose to do it. And so when we see mankind in the first instance when he's created, we understand that at creation, atonement, the idea of atonement, was an unknown and an unneeded concept. While they were in the Garden of Eden in perfect harmony with God, there was no need whatever for there to be atonement in any sense. But then came the fall, right? And we call this the fall, when mankind sinned. Now, note straight away that sin was not accidental. We call it the fall of mankind. And sometimes we get a picture that mankind was just walking along and he accidentally fell into sin. Well, no, the fall was not accidental. Sin was deliberate, willful, knowing disobedience and rebellion against God, and sin always is. Right? We read Genesis 3:1-8, and we saw that mankind deliberately sinned. Now, they knew the consequences. They knew, because God had said, Don't eat that fruit, and if you eat that fruit, you will die. and yet they went and they deliberately did it. So what happened when man sinned? Well, communion with God was destroyed. Genesis 3, 7 and 8. And the eyes of them both were opened, and they knew that they were naked, and they sewed fig leaves together and made themselves aprons. And they heard the voice of the Lord God walking in the garden in the cool of the day, and Adam and his wife hid themselves from the